The White House press briefing room buzzed with anticipation as journalists and political analysts took their seats, cameras flashing and microphones poised for the daily press conference. At the podium stood Karoline Leavitt, the sharp-witted and composed White House press secretary, representing President Donald Trump's administration in what was expected to be another heated exchange with the press. Outside the press room, a storm had been brewing. Professor Alan Whitman, a well-known left-leaning scholar from Harvard, had recently made national headlines for his controversial remarks. During a televised debate on faith and governance, he had dismissed Jesus Christ as a fairy tale, igniting outrage among many Americans, particularly conservative and Christian communities. The White House press conference was meant to focus on economic policies, but it didn't take long before the topic shifted. A journalist from the Washington Chronicle, Emily Sanders, raised her hand. Karoline, maintaining her characteristic calm demeanor, nodded in her direction. Ms. Leavitt, Professor Alan Whitman recently stated that Jesus is nothing more than a fairy tale, a myth perpetuated by those who refuse to embrace modern science and rational thought. Given that many Americans, including the president himself, are people of faith, does the White House have an official response to this statement? The room fell silent, with cameras zooming in, eager to capture the response. Karoline adjusted the microphone, her blue eyes scanning the room before she spoke. "Let me be clear," she began, her voice measured yet firm. "Professor Whitman is entitled to his opinion, as is every American. That's the beauty of our great country. Our First Amendment protects free speech. But let's not confuse opinion with truth. Calling Jesus Christ a fairy tale is not only deeply offensive to millions of Christians but also historically inaccurate. Jesus was a real historical figure, and whether one believes in his divinity or not, dismissing him as fiction is an act of intellectual dishonesty." A murmur rippled through the room. Some journalists took rapid notes, while others exchanged glances. But before the dust could settle, a sudden voice interrupted the session, one that no one expected. Professor Alan Whitman himself had just entered the briefing room. Dressed in his signature tweed jacket and wire-rimmed glasses, he strode to the front, ignoring the stunned expressions around him. "Ms. Leavitt, would you be willing to debate me on this issue? Right here, right now?" he challenged. The tension in the room skyrocketed. Reporters held their breath, eager to see how Karoline would respond. She didn't hesitate. "You're welcome to ask a question, Professor. But if you're looking for a debate, I suggest a more appropriate venue. The White House podium is not a stage for ideological duels. It's a place for truth." The professor smirked. "Truth? That's precisely what I'm here to discuss. If Jesus was real, where's the proof?" Karoline's expression didn't falter. She stepped forward, gripping the podium. "You want proof? Let's talk about proof." The press room held its breath as the battle of intellects was about to begin. The room remained eerily silent, save for the distant clicking of cameras capturing every expression, every movement. This was no longer just a White House press briefing. It had transformed into an ideological showdown between a respected government official and a controversial academic. Professor Alan Whitman adjusted his glasses, his smirk widening. "Yes, Ms. Leavitt, let's talk about proof. If Jesus truly existed, why is there no concrete scientific evidence? No DNA, no verified artifacts, nothing that proves he was the Son of God. Isn't it convenient that all we have are stories written decades after his supposed death?" Some journalists nodded, eager to hear how Karoline would respond. Others, particularly from conservative networks, sat with clenched jaws, ready to defend their faith. Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, placing both hands on the podium as if bracing for battle. "Professor, I find it fascinating that someone of your academic background would make such an oversimplified claim. You ask for proof, yet you ignore the mountain of historical evidence that supports Jesus' existence. Are you suggesting that renowned historians, both secular and religious, who have documented his life are all mistaken?" Professor Whitman folded his arms. "Historians can be biased. They write from the perspective of their time, influenced by political and religious forces. What I'm asking for is tangible, scientific proof, something indisputable. Karoline's lips curved into a knowing smile. Let's start with historical accounts. Non-Christian sources, such as the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus, both documented Jesus as a real person who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. These are not biblical sources, they are historical records. Are you claiming that these prominent historians fabricated their accounts? Whitman hesitated for the first time. He had expected religious arguments, not a well-prepared historical case. But he quickly recovered. Fine, I'll concede that a man named Jesus may have existed. But that doesn't prove he was divine. That's where faith and fairy tales come in. People believe what they want to believe. Karoline's expression didn't waver. And yet, Professor, people like you believe that everything must be proven in a lab to be real. But let's test that logic. Do you believe in love? Whitman blinked. What? Love? She repeated. Can you scientifically prove that love exists? Not the biological reactions, not the chemicals in the brain. Can you prove love itself? Can you see it, measure it, put it in a beaker? The professor scoffed. That's a false equivalency. Love is a human emotion, not a historical claim. Karoline didn't back down. Yet millions experience it. Millions die for it. They build their lives around it. Just because something isn't physically tangible doesn't mean it isn't real. A hushed murmur swept across the room. Even the most skeptical reporters found themselves drawn into her logic. Professor Whitman, however, wasn't done. He squared his shoulders, preparing for his final push. I see what you're doing, Ms. Leavitt. You're appealing to emotion instead of reason. But faith doesn't belong in government discussions. We live in a secular nation and religion should have no bearing on policy. Karoline's eyes gleamed. She had been waiting for this argument. And yet, Professor, every great leader, from the founding fathers to Abraham Lincoln, has acknowledged the role of faith in shaping America's principles. Our Constitution protects religious freedom, but it does not erase faith from public life. If anything, it guarantees that no government can dictate what a person should believe. You claim that Jesus is a fairy tale, but that claim itself is an attempt to silence faith under the guise of intellectual superiority. The room was now electric. Some reporters nodded, others frantically scribbled notes. Even the most skeptical journalists found it hard to deny that Karoline had skillfully turned the argument on its head. Professor Whitman exhaled sharply, visibly frustrated. He had underestimated her. So you're saying people should just believe in Jesus because it makes them feel good? He asked, grasping for a counterpoint. Karoline shook her head. No, Professor. I'm saying people should seek truth wherever it leads. And history, reason, and personal experience all point to the fact that Jesus is far more than a fairy tale. The professor opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the room erupted in applause. The battle wasn't over. But for the moment, it was clear Karoline Leavitt had just won round one. The spontaneous applause that erupted in the White House press briefing room was unlike anything seen before. It wasn't a political rally, yet Karoline Leavitt's words had struck a chord. Even some reporters known for their hostile questioning of the administration exchanged curious glances as if silently admitting that she had just delivered an undeniable truth. But Professor Alan Whitman wasn't finished. His academic reputation was at stake, and the last thing he wanted was to be outmaneuvered by a government spokesperson. He raised a hand, signaling for silence. The applause gradually died down and the room returned to its tense intellectual battlefield. Ms. Leavitt, I'll admit you're a skilled debater, Whitman said, his tone measured but laced with frustration. But let's be honest here. If we based our entire reality on personal experience and historical anecdotes, we'd have to accept every mythology ever written. Ancient Egyptians believed in Osiris. The Greeks worshipped Zeus. Are you saying their gods were real too? Karoline's response was immediate. There's a difference between myth and historical reality, Professor. No serious historian denies that Jesus of Nazareth existed. His impact shaped the entire world. You can question his divinity, but dismissing him as a fairy tale. That's not scholarly debate. That's willful ignorance. Professor Whitman narrowed his eyes. All right, let's set aside history for a moment. Let's talk about logic. You're a government official, speaking on behalf of the most powerful office in the world. Don't you think it's dangerous to mix faith with politics? Isn't the separation of church and state a fundamental principle of American democracy? Karoline nodded. Yes, Professor, and I fully support the separation of church and state. But separation of church and state does not mean the separation of faith from society. You see, our founding fathers never intended to remove faith from public life. In fact, they recognized that a moral and religious foundation was essential to the survival of a free nation. She then reached into the folder beside her and pulled out a small printed document. Holding it up for the cameras, she said, "This is a copy of George Washington's farewell address. In it, he states, and I quote, 'Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports.' Now, tell me, Professor, was our first president also spreading fairy tales?" Whitman shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't expected her to come armed with the words of the very figures who built America. But Karoline wasn't done. She flipped to another page. "Here's John Adams, our second president, who wrote, 'Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other.'" She let the words settle in. The silence in the room was almost deafening. Finally, she looked directly at Whitman. "So, Professor, if faith was good enough for the founding fathers, why is it suddenly a threat to democracy today?" Whitman had no immediate response. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. Some journalists stared at their notepads, clearly reevaluating their own perspectives. Others simply looked stunned. Sensing the momentum shifting, Karoline delivered one final statement that would make headlines across the nation. "You claim that Jesus is a fairy tale, Professor. But here's the real fairy tale. The belief that America can thrive while abandoning the very faith and values that built it." This time, the applause was even louder. Whitman clenched his jaw. He had come here expecting to dismantle faith with reason, but instead he had encountered reason backed by faith. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure how to respond. The battle was nearly over. But Karoline had one final move left to make. The applause slowly faded, but the tension in the room remained thick. Everyone could see it. Professor Alan Whitman was rattled. He had entered the White House briefing room confident that he would make Karoline Leavitt stumble, that he would expose her as just another government mouthpiece relying on faith instead of reason. Instead, he had walked into a storm. He adjusted his glasses and forced a small chuckle. "I must admit, Ms. Leavitt, you are quite the speaker. I see why President Trump chose you for this position." Karoline offered a polite but firm smile. "Flattery won't get you out of this debate, Professor." A few reporters chuckled. Even those who often criticized the administration couldn't deny that she was handling herself masterfully. Whitman exhaled sharply and leaned against the podium. "Let's forget history for a second. Let's forget the founding fathers. Let's focus on the present. You claim faith is essential for a nation's survival, but let me ask you this: how has religion made the world better? Wars have been fought over it. People have been killed in the name of God. Isn't it fair to say that faith has caused more harm than good?" Some journalists nodded in agreement, sensing that Whitman was making one last desperate push. But Karoline was ready for it. She took a slow breath before responding. "Professor, have some people committed evil in the name of religion? Yes. But let's not confuse human corruption with faith itself. If you're going to blame religion for every war and atrocity, then by that logic, you should also blame science for every weapon of mass destruction." Whitman flinched. She had flipped his own reasoning against him. Karoline continued, her voice unwavering. "The truth is, faith has done more to uplift humanity than anything else. Christianity alone has been the foundation for hospitals, orphanages, charities, and social justice movements. The abolition of slavery? Led by Christians. The civil rights movement? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor who fought for justice through his faith. Even today, churches and religious organizations provide millions in aid to the poor, the sick, and the suffering." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Tell me, Professor, does that sound like a fairy tale to you?" Whitman had no response. He looked down for a moment, seemingly lost in thought. The journalists waited, pens hovering over their notepads, cameras locked onto his face. Finally, he sighed and looked up. "I suppose. I never really thought about it that way." The room collectively gasped. Professor Alan Whitman, the outspoken atheist, the critic of faith, had just admitted he might have been wrong. Karoline nodded, her expression softening. "That's the beauty of truth, Professor. It's always there, waiting to be seen." A long silence followed. Then, without another word, Whitman gave a small nod, turned, and walked out of the press briefing room. For the first time in his career, he had lost a debate. And Karoline Leavitt had just made history. As the doors of the press briefing room swung shut behind Professor Alan Whitman, a heavy silence remained. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The cameras captured every detail: Karoline Leavitt standing firm at the podium, her expression composed yet triumphant, while the once unshakable professor had left the room visibly unsettled. Then, suddenly, applause broke out once again, this time even louder than before. It wasn't just coming from conservative reporters but from journalists of all backgrounds, even some who had built their careers criticizing the Trump administration. Karoline held up a hand to quiet the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but let's not mistake this for a personal victory. This isn't about me or Professor Whitman, it's about truth. And truth doesn't need to be defended, it only needs to be revealed." A reporter from CNN, who had never been particularly friendly toward the administration, stood up. "Ms. Leavitt, do you think today's debate will change anything? Will this moment have a lasting impact?" Karoline smiled thoughtfully. "I can't say for sure. But I do know this faith is not a weakness. It's a strength. And millions of Americans shouldn't be made to feel ashamed for believing in something greater than themselves." Another journalist, this time from Fox News, quickly followed up. Professor Whitman seemed shaken by the discussion. "Do you think he might reconsider his views?" Karoline shook her head. "That's not for me to decide. People arrive at truth in their own time and in their own way. But if today's discussion made even one person think deeper about faith, then it was worth it." The questions continued for several more minutes, some critical, some supportive, but all captivated by what had just unfolded. Then, as the press conference wrapped up, Karoline gathered her notes and stepped off the podium. She had done her job not just as the White House press secretary but as a defender of truth. But the impact of this debate was far from over. Within hours, clips of the debate spread like wildfire across social media. Hashtag Leavitt versus Whitman began trending on X, formerly Twitter. News outlets, both liberal and conservative, rushed to analyze the exchange. Fox News headline: Karoline Leavitt schools atheist professor in debate over Jesus. CNN headline: Fiery exchange between White House press secretary and professor goes viral. The New York Times: Leavitt versus Whitman, a cultural moment or political strategy? While Karoline's supporters celebrated, the biggest shock came from an unexpected source: Professor Alan Whitman himself. The next morning, he appeared on a live television interview with MSNBC. The host wasted no time. "Professor Whitman, you've debated religion for decades. But yesterday, for the first time, you seemed shaken. Did Karoline Leavitt make you rethink your stance?" Whitman sighed, rubbing his forehead before responding. "Look, I don't believe in sudden conversions. But I'll admit, yesterday was different. I walked into that room expecting to dismantle faith with reason. Instead, I found someone who used reason to defend faith. And that made me think." The host raised an eyebrow. "So, you're saying she won?" Whitman chuckled. "Let's just say she made me realize that dismissing faith as a fairy tale is an oversimplification. Maybe, just maybe, there's more to it than I was willing to admit." Across America, churches, universities, and newsrooms buzzed with discussion about the debate. Faith leaders praised Karoline Leavitt for her bold defense of Christianity. Atheists and skeptics engaged in deep conversations about whether faith and reason could coexist. Political analysts debated whether this moment could reshape the cultural landscape. But for Karoline, it wasn't about politics. It was about truth. That night, as she sat in her office, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Unknown, I may never believe in Jesus. But I respect you for standing up for what you believe in. Thank you for the debate." She smiled, recognizing the sender immediately: Professor Alan Whitman. For the first time in his life, he was willing to consider the possibility that faith wasn't a fairy tale after all. And that was a victory far greater than any debate.